Today, part 2 of Christianity in the Pax Romana. By the early 2nd century AD, virtually anybody who dwelt in just about any city in the Roman Empire would have heard about Christianity. It was a new, intriguing, perhaps even mysterious religion. And although there were plenty of skeptics and even enemies of Christianity, it was nevertheless growing and spreading. In addition to the people that joined the church because they truly were converted to Christianity, there were also plenty of people who affiliated with the church or became close with Christians, but continued to practice the kinds of lifestyles and religious rituals that they had prior to becoming involved with Christianity. If you compare what the New Testament epistles say about Christianity versus what you have learned on this podcast about Roman religion, it is clear that there is not a lot of overlap there. But that doesn't mean people did not try to reconcile their existing way of living with Christianity. We will talk about those people, the earliest cultural Christians, on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 62, Christianity in the Pax Romana, Part 2. Before I get too far along into today's topic, I want to acknowledge a book that was very helpful, not only in bringing this subject to my attention, but collecting some examples that I myself found very helpful when putting together this podcast. And this is the book, Cultural Christians in the Early Church by Nadia Williams. I recommend you check it out, give it a read. Nadia also has an accompanying set of video lectures that I recommend checking out also. One of the things that we see very clearly in the New Testament Gospels and epistles is the exclusive claim of Christianity that Jesus is God's only Son and the only way to God, that one is not to worship Christ and also worship other gods. This core doctrine of Christianity was one of the most difficult to accept for those who wanted to be Christians, but also continue in the religions of the Roman world. There are plenty of images and inscriptions and mosaics from the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries AD, which testify to attempts to merge Christianity and traditional Roman religions. There are numerous grave markers, for example, many of them found in and around Rome, which have Christian imagery on them, such as the fish or the ichthys monogram, which also looks like bread, referencing Jesus feeding the 5,000 with fish and loaves. But on these same markers, we would see the letters DM, which stands for demones, a phrase that commits the person who died to the world of the spirits of the departed. It references a non-Christian framework for the afterlife. A tomb found in Rome, the tomb of the Julii, which dates from the mid-3rd century, shows an image of what looks like Jesus surrounded by a fisherman, a shepherd, and a scene that looks like Jonah being swallowed by the fish. And yet he is also riding a chariot with the rays of the sun behind his head, common features of ancient sun gods like Apollo, Helios, or Sol. And the last of these, Sol, was very popular in the Roman Empire at this time. Sol was also born around the time of the winter solstice on December the 25th. Now, we don't know why the family that built this tomb merged imagery which was clearly related to Christ and Christianity with sun god worship as well. Were these Christians who sought to avoid persecution or ridicule? Did these people think that Christ was just a version or a facet or an incarnation of Sol? We don't know. But this kind of merged iconography shows up often, even in other parts of the Roman Empire. Over in Dorset, on the island of Great Britain, a 4th century mosaic shows the famous Chi Rho symbol. This is a symbol which Constantine, an emperor in the early 4th century, and indeed the first Christian emperor, had inscribed on the shields of his soldiers as he fought a long civil war for control of the Roman Empire. So we see that same image on this mosaic, but the figure in the mosaic looks quite a bit like images of Christ. He could be Apollo. He could be Christ. We don't really know. And this seems to be on purpose. In addition to connecting imagery associated with non-Christian gods and Christ, we also see practices that most Christians would find unfavorable continuing to be practiced in the church. People in the church in Corinth, for example, as early as the first century, wrestled with Greek cultural norms about the human body. Now, many in the Roman world saw their bodies as their own, and what they did with their body was irrelevant to their soul. And while there were some rules governing sexual relationships in Roman culture, it was still a pervasive view that sexual activity outside of the marriage relationship, especially for men, was totally normal and acceptable. In Roman and Greek culture, frequenting a prostitute, for example, would not be seen as immoral, and for a married man, it wouldn't necessarily be seen as adulterous. In some cases, it would be seen as healthy and normal for a man to use the services of a prostitute. Prostitution was common, cheap, and widely available. We have some graffiti in Pompeii which suggests that prostitutes could be hired for the same price as lunch. And prostitutes could be found just about anywhere, public spaces, baths, and prostitution was a normal part of many religious festivals and rituals. In Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, he says this, "Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as it is written, the two will become one flesh. But he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him." Men in the Corinthian church were using prostitutes as they had prior to joining the church. Probably some of these men were even married. But what Paul says is his own teaching and what we see in established scripture in the Old Testament, adultery, fornication, these are clearly not permitted. And Paul confronts this issue quite directly. Sexual immorality disgraces an individual. It disgraces the larger church body. A relationship with a prostitute is not meaningless. It's not casual. It's actually an act of joining. But Christians are the bride of Christ. They are in union with Christ already. So the Christian body is not his or her own. And this is a radically different view of the human body and of sex than we see in the broader Greco-Roman culture at the time. And it was clearly an ongoing issue of friction, both for those who wished to join the church and also even for those who had already joined the church. Another issue which I brought up in the last episode of this podcast, episode 61, was the issue of joining the Roman military. During the Pax Romana, as we have already covered on episodes 44, 45, and 46, all on the Roman military, the empire had a volunteer army, and it was a professional army. Therefore, it was a choice whether a man enlisted in the military. So why did so many people go into the legions? Well, for many in the Roman world, a career in the military offered a route out of poverty and into citizenship, perhaps even into a healthy retirement, maybe even some land. All of these things were not easy to achieve on one's own. The economy of the Roman Empire simply did not have the kind of opportunities for rapid upward mobility that we see in modern economies. But there were some costs to joining the military, especially prior to the age of Septimius Severus. And we talked about Septimius's military reforms on episode 60. But prior to those reforms, soldiers were not allowed to marry. They were not allowed to have legitimate children. Of course, many soldiers still had long-term relationships with women, and they had children, but these children were not legally their legitimate children. Roman soldiers were also required to follow the orders of those above them, and to do this without question, no matter what the order was. They swore a personal oath of loyalty to the empire, and it was a severe oath. I've talked about these kinds of oaths before, and I've given you an example, but just as a recap, these oaths were sworn to just about all of the major Roman deities. They were sworn to the emperor. They included curses for any violation of the oath. It does not look anything like a modern oath. And it is a personal and divine oath, whereas many modern military oaths are sworn in defense of, say, the Constitution of the United States of America. And there is a military code which provides many legitimate exemptions to, say, following unlawful or illegitimate orders from a superior. The Romans don't have anything like that. And so just the military oath alone would have been prohibitive for a Christian. It would have been very difficult for a Christian to swear to all of these gods when there is clearly an exclusivity mandate also placed on the Christian at the same time. And as we saw in the last episode, any Christian who became a soldier after becoming a Christian would be kicked out of the church. And if a person who was a soldier decided to then become a Christian, for all intents and purposes, they needed to retire from soldiering. Roman soldiers could be ordered at any time to perform massacres. They could be ordered to murder Christians even. Roman soldiers were well known for living lives that could be corrupt, debaucherous, and involving all sorts of practical and ethical violations of the Christian faith. But we know from ancient sources that there were people who identified as Christians in the Roman military. We see this in sources from the 2nd century AD. An entire unit of Christians, for example, supposedly served under Marcus Aurelius, fighting in the Marcomannic War, which I talk about in detail on episode 52. In that war, a miracle occurred. And this miracle is even memorialized on the column of Marcus Aurelius, which still stands in Rome to this day. It was a hot summer in AD 172, and this legion that supposedly had Christians in it found themselves surrounded by thousands of enemy warriors, and they had run out of water. They were considering surrendering. But the Christians in the legion were told by some sources, prayed for deliverance. A storm came, they filled their helmets and shields with water, and the enemy, who were highly superstitious, viewed the storm and the lightning and the hail that evidently struck some of them as unfavorable omens, and they ran off. This account survives in a portion of Cassius Dio's Roman history. We don't know if it was later edited. Some Christians claim that this rain miracle was due to prayers to the Christian God. Other sources claim that there were just magicians or other kinds of religious activity going on, so it's difficult to sort out. But the claim, at least, that there were Christians in this particular legion does not work if it was not already a kind of common knowledge that soldiers in the Roman military did, at least some of them, claim to be Christians. And of course, the interesting thing about the story as well is that we see a kind of contractual negotiation here, not unlike the way that Roman religion works. The Christians are in a bad situation, and so they perform a religious ritual, that is, they pray, and then God responds to the ritual. If you took the Christianity out of this story and just made these people worshipers of Jupiter or Zeus or something, it would still make perfect logical sense to a Roman. So in the cities and among the armies were plenty of people calling themselves Christians, but continuing to engage in the mainstream culture. But not everybody was interested in even nominally joining the church. There were plenty who were openly hostile to Christianity. And on the next episode, we will talk about those defenders of Christianity, the apologists, men like Tertullian, who lived in North Africa, one of the parts of the Roman world that experienced fierce persecution as the Pax Romana was ending. What were the principal accusations against Christians, and how did Christian apologists defend their faith? We will examine these issues and more on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.